The following program is for informational and educational purposes only. It is not to be considered legal advice. Fraudsters Radio was created to expose the many scams and frauds that have so infected society today. Scammers, fraudsters, and rip-off artists abound, whether it's scamming homeowners with bogus foreclosure relief services, dating fraud, incompetent lawyers, or consumer rip-offs. It's high time the public has a voice. If you work in a profession that deals with fraud, or if you believe you were or are a victim of fraud, you now have a radio listening public that wants to hear from you. Please feel free to message us through our Fraudsters Radio Facebook page, and we may have you on the show as a guest. If you'd like to call in for today's show, the number is 646-668-8512.
And welcome to Fraudsters Radio. I'm Lori Z, nationally syndicated radio host and consumer advocate, with my co-host, Storm Bradford, the owner of Mortgage Fraud Examiner. Storm, what's happening today? Tell me something good.
Yeah, something real good. We got one of the foremost experts on appraisals in the country coming on as a guest today. So, kind of excited about that because he's going to get down and dirty and tell everybody what is involved in these appraisals and how they can be used to go after the bad guys and save your home.
Yep, and we've talked about mortgage fraud. We talked a little bit about appraisal fraud because that's involved when you do a fraud exam. But, before the show, we talked a little bit. You mentioned today that another person got in trouble. And so there are a lot of schemers that form these Facebook groups. I mean, I've seen people who say, yeah, you can copyright a mortgage. Or, yes, you have $1 million in a treasury account. We all have $1 million in a treasury account. Or, it's not real money. It's not real money when you buy your house. And so, talk to me a little bit about some of those groups that you see, because they're all going off in the wrong direction, and then they end up in jail, right? And it's a felony.
Yeah, they do. Well, part of the problem is that you'll have, a lot of them are absolute crackpots. I mean, for anybody to believe that they have $100 million in a treasury account and their birth certificate is the account number, it's got to screw loose someplace. So you have people like that. You have others that the bank never lent you money. And my answer to them is, well, what was this, like the Indians? They gave you seashells. How did you buy your house? How did you get a refi and take cash out if they never gave you money? I mean, the arguments are nonsensical at best. I mean, it's just total nonsense. But what you have happen is they mix lies with the truth, and they give alleged quotes out of court cases that are made up to support their narratives, and they'll do the same thing with statutes and other type things. And then what they have is what we call, it's a political term. Actually, I didn't make it up. It's called useful idiots. That what they have is you have somebody that speaks all this rhetoric and other type of nonsense, and then what these useful idiots do is they parrot it. And now it's almost like multi-level marketing. You got one person tells two people, those two people tell four people, and then it just goes out exponentially. And then before you know it, you got hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people believing it. And all they're doing is just repeating nonsense and never did any independent research of their own other than what was force-fed them by these scammers that put in these make-up cases, made-up cases, and everything else.
Right. Well, you got a lot of desperate people, though. And so, back when the housing bubble broke, there were tons of these foreclosure companies, some run by attorneys, some run by people who had no qualifications at all, and people were desperate, and so they didn't necessarily, like I found you through somebody, as an accident working as a credit consultant, but some of these things that I've been, heard the stories over the years, it almost made me want to believe some of them. I went, wow, this is a way to get out. and it's not true. And so you have these people who are desperate. Then, of course, they hire what you call the pretender defender attorneys, which is so true, especially here in Florida, because I think I told you I contacted over 200 attorneys, and not one of them, not one, would either file a lawsuit based on things like appraisal fraud or counterclaim, because I'm sorry to say this, but the majority of people I spoke to were lazy. They didn't want to go to court. I was told they didn't want to litigate. They just wanted to charge a monthly fee, do very little work.
The reason why they didn't want to litigate is because they didn't have any evidence. And these attorneys don't know how to analyze these mortgage transactions or analyze appraisals. And because of that, they've got nothing to go to court with. So it's not that they didn't want to litigate it. It's just that they couldn't litigate it because it's like prosecuting a crime. If you don't have, you might have a defendant, but if you have no evidence of a crime, there's no way that you can, can he be found guilty, and that's the problem. But let me tell you this. A lot of people are, in a sense, almost as bad as the scammers, and here's why. I know I've had plenty of people call me over the years, and they'll tell me about some scammer. And I'll explain to them how it's a scam. They thoroughly understand that it's a scam. I give them the proof that it's a scam. They know who the guy is. And I said, look, you need to turn him in. And they don't turn him in.
Well, they may be afraid. They may be afraid. I mean, some of my stories.
They're not afraid. Yeah. I hear they come back and they'll say, oh, well, he's a nice guy. I said, excuse me. I had a woman here years ago. She had lost her house through a foreclosure. She came to us. We did an analysis and got her house back, settlement with the bank. And I said, look, and she paid this attorney $30,000 to lose her house. He had suckered her into buying one of these scam securitization audits and then made arguments through that scam to the court and got laughed out of court. So I told her, I said, look, you need to turn this guy in. And she goes, well, he's really a nice guy. I say, excuse me? That's con artists are nice guys. They're nice guys because they're conning you and letting you think that they're your friends. And I said, this son of a bitch cost you to lose your house. And by the grace of God, you found us to analyze that transaction where we found stuff that you could use against the bank. And I said, he ripped you off for $30,000. You need to get your $30,000 back and file a complaint with the local bar. And I said, trust me, he's doing it to other people. And she goes, yeah, that's true. She goes, he hit my sister up for $30,000. She lost her home, and hit my best friend up for $30,000. She lost her home. And I said, and you're going to give this guy a pass? That's the problem. I hear it all the time. He's a nice guy, or he's got a disease, or it's amazing how many of these scammers have diseases.
Right. Now, you said before the housing bubble, you said there were no foreclosure attorneys, you told me. There was no category for foreclosure defense, correct?
Well, no, there was no such thing before 2006 as a foreclosure defense attorney because they didn't exist. They were all doing something else. But I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about these scammers that are telling people all this other nonsense. And those, I can't tell you, I know of at least 5 or 6 of these scammers that allegedly have cancer. Now, it's either God's punishing them for scamming people, or it's just another scam that they're feeding people that they've got this deadly disease, and, hey, buy my scam because I need the money to pay for my chemotherapy or whatever nonsense that they're giving them. And the same guy that was alive 10 years ago is alive today.
Yeah.
So, that's part of the problem is nobody's turning in these lawyers. Nobody's turning in these chain of title, securitization, forensic loan auditors. They need to be turned in. And that's part of our job here is we're trying to educate the public on what works and what doesn't work. Just like the agents that we've had on from the FBI and the IRS, they said they were thanking us as we were thanking them, because this is how you stop the scams, is by educating people about the scams before they get scammed.
Right, but I think a lot of people are embarrassed that they've been scammed, and maybe they don't know, what regulatory agency to go to. They might know the FBI because the police are just going to tell them it's a civil matter, but I don't think they necessarily know. And some of them may, either they don't know or maybe they're afraid. But if you had enough people complaining about a particular person or company that's doing the scam, I think if you had a lot of complaints, that's what triggers an FBI investigation or a police investigation into it.
The problem of it is there's nobody out there that's telling them that they were scammed, because they don't read where the courts have said these securitization forensic chain of title auditors are charlatans and their paperwork is empty gimmickry. They don't have access to court cases like law firms do or litigation support companies do like we do. All they get fed is the nonsense that the scammers are giving them, and they don't have knowledge of this. That's why at Mortgage Fraud Examiners, we're educating people. That's why one of the things we have this radio show for is to educate people so they can spread the word.
Right. I agree. Because if you don't know, yeah, you could be in any group and think this is the group. You look at the group and go, wow, there's 10,000 people in this group. It must be real. And it's the same thing I explain to people when they Google, especially like just as an example for medication. If you Google something about medication and you're not going to a site like WebMD or the Mayo Clinic, it could be anybody posting information, and that's where a lot of deaths actually occur. So it's kind of the same analogy here is you can see a ton of people on it. They could have a website on it, but most people are not going to know what's real or not. And over the years, I've come to you with a lot of things like, hey, I forwarded you. I go, hey, what do you think of this? And you'll come back and go, scam, and then you explain why. And so it makes sense to me because we've known each other so many years. I get it. But a lot of the listeners, they don't know anything about it, and that's what they see. They see 10,000 people in a group, and these people that are in these groups, they sign up for all of the groups. And so you have your own group, the stopping, the foreclosure strategies that actually work group, and still I see people in there, challenging you or questioning you, and you have to go back and explain for the millionth time why a securitization audit does not hold up.
Yeah, well, again, these people, they get scammed. And they want answers. And good. I like questions. Ask questions. Most people don't ask questions. They just read it. I was reading a case today. It's one of that Neil Garfield screwball, and one of his attorneys just got spanked by a court at the Ninth Circuit, and the court sanctioned them, gave the bank $70,000 in their legal fees and then another $20,000 in sanctions, and said that the court was basically saying that the reason why they were giving them this extra $20,000 in sanctions was for wasting the court's time and wasting the bank's time for making such a stupid argument, that they couldn't believe that this lawyer was that stupid. And they said, no objectively reasonable lawyer could think that a lender who is listed on the contract didn't give him the money.
Right. Well, I want to ask you a kind of a bizarre question. Yeah, I want to ask you a bizarre question before we get a break, which is why aren't attorneys, why doesn't the Bar Association, if they have continuing education courses, for example, for attorneys, and I don't know if they do foreclosures for attorneys, but it seems like the bar should be a lot more involved in what they tell their attorneys to do or what is not legal to do.
Well, that's not what bars do. That's not what bars do. That's not the purpose of the bar. They've got continuing education classes and things like that. But the bar itself doesn't really do that stuff. The problem of it is, for an example, I have an attorney that all he's ever done is wills. Okay, wills and trusts.
Right.
And now, all of a sudden, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people in Florida where you are, tens of thousands of people who are in foreclosure because they haven't been making their mortgage payments. So hey, wait a minute, this guy over here, he's making $30,000 to $40,000 per homeowner, and all he's doing is just basically waiting for it to come to court 3 years before he really has to do anything. Well, hell, he doesn't know how to fight a court case. He has no evidence. He's got nothing that he can go to court with. So what he does is he goes to there was a guy giving CLEs down in Florida who was a nurse. He was a male nurse. And his claim to fame is that he had spent about 100 hours reading up on the Truth in Lending Act.
Well, that does, I don't know. To me, that's not. Yeah, how does the bar though let somebody like that teach? You know, if they're not an attorney, how can they be qualified even to teach a class like that?
Because you don't have to be an attorney to give a CLE for a continuing education for a lawyer. They're just looking. They got to do so many. They got to have so many credits a year to keep their license in. So basically, they have morons like this guy going in. And basically, it's just a bunch of nonsense that he's telling people. And that happens in almost every profession. It's disgusting.
Scary thought. Well, let's do this, Storm. Let's go to a commercial break. When we come back, you can introduce our special guest. So we will be back in a moment. Stay with us.
Have you received a notice of foreclosure on your property? Do you suspect that you're involved in an unfair or fraudulent loan agreement? Are you looking for a way to save your home? Would you like to cut through all the misinformation and find out what really works? Would you like to learn strategies that the so-called gurus aren't aware of? If you answered yes to any of those questions, a professional team at Mortgage Fraud Examiners can assist you and your attorney with all of these things and more. Contract breaches, errors, statutory regulatory violations, fraudulent appraisals, and other fraudulent conduct cause most mortgages to be legally problematic. In fact, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation found that nearly 2,000 financial institutions they assessed received citations for significant compliance violations. They also examined appraisals and found out that of the 259 appraisals reviewed for accuracy, only 7 fully complied with professional standards. Call us at 844-920-7200. That's 844-920-7200. Mortgage Fraud Examiners, 844-920-7200.
Okay, we're back on AM/FM 24/7 radio. The call-in number is area code 646-668-8512. And we've got an esteemed guest today. His name is Dennis Black. And Dennis Black is, he has a company. It's called Correct Assessment. And his website is correctassessment.net. And Dennis has been a National Instructor of the Year, National Appraiser of the Year. He's a certified USPAP instructor. He testifies against appraisers that have wrongfully appraised homes. He's recognized as an expert witness around the country. And he was a handful of appraisers who testified before the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission about appraisal fraud and its effect on the financial crisis in 2008. Dennis, welcome aboard.
Thank you very much, Storm. Happy to be here. First thing is, how do I apply to get my $1 million? Mrs. Black would be very happy with that.
Yeah. We'd all be happy with that.
Yeah. We'd all be happy with it. I think so.
Can you tell us, start off, I mean, make it pretty easy, the FDIC found that 76%, when they sent their bank examiners out, they found that 76% of the appraisals were problematic. We do these transaction analysis all over the country, and our stats are a touch higher, on average about 80%, but in certain states, which I have defined as foreclosure capitals, we see it as high as 90%. Do you have any stats that you've kept or what you think is probably a correct number?
I think that you're really looking at probably a situation where, 3/4 of the appraisals have some substantial issue, when you look at things. But one of the things that I think skews those a little bit is I tend to see stuff that is already being somebody's wanting to look at it. So I think that tends to pump the numbers a little bit. But I can tell you this, because of my background as an instructor, I have taught, 15, 17 states, something like that, continuing education classes for appraisers. And I've also taught some for real estate agents. And it is one of the things that you see within the class, those who are interested and those that really don't care. And fortunately, the profession is clearing up, I think, somewhat. But we had a problem here going back to the financial crisis where to become an appraiser, it was, you were taking 2 quick weeks of, night school essentially, and you were in, and then a quick 2-year apprenticeship, and you were able to then move along. And, so that became a very diluted situation as far as the level of education and training, which created a lot of problems. And then you also see the problem of, and it happens everywhere, pretty much in every walk of life, but appraisers are supposed to be immune from it. We are supposed to be what the standards refer to as independent, impartial, and objective, not worried about the transaction. We're not part of the transaction. We're not part of what you're trying to accomplish. If you're trying to do a mortgage, if you're trying to get a divorce, I don't care which side I'm on. The facts wash out the way they wash out. But the overwhelming majority of appraisals are done for mortgage origination. And the reality is that if you're not doing what the lender wants, the lender will go find somebody else that does. And that is too often the case. And, then I end up involved sometime later, and I have seen situations, the most common is the comparables. We might have a house that it is a normal 1/4 acre lot in a nice subdivision, but it's looking up to the back of another house. Well, all of the comparable sales that the appraiser is comparing it to are backing up to a golf course, or they're, on a boating canal where you can go out to the Gulf of Mexico or to the Atlantic Ocean or wherever. And there's no adjustment for that. It's just, the appraiser just calls it equal and moves on. And until somebody else looks at that really wants to look at it, as opposed to somebody who's trying to lend money, it just moves along the way. Because let's face it, the lender gets paid a commission, so they're trying to sell the money.
The mortgage broker, yeah. Well,
yeah.
And I know you're familiar with this, and we're intimately familiar with it. That back from 2000 to about 2008, these brokers had what they referred to as their approved appraisal list, where they had this set amount of appraisers on their list. They'd call up Joe the appraiser and say, "Hey, Joe, I need for you to come back with $400,000 on this house." Joe the appraiser would go out and come back and say, "Look, it's not worth $400,000. It's only worth $290,000. And the broker would say, "Hey, Joe, need I remind you that you're on an approved appraiser list, which you won't be any longer unless you give me the $400,000. Well, Joe the appraiser wanted to keep getting the business, keep a roof over his head. So he said, "Well, nobody's really going to find out about this. I'll just say it's worth $400,000. How familiar are you with that, and were you ever approached that way?
I certainly was approached that way. I always used to use the joke when somebody would come to me and say, "Well, look, we've heard great things about you. We would like to have you on our approved list." And then they would go with the coded words, "How are your numbers?" And being a bit of a smart aleck, I would always respond base 10. Which usually then stopped the conversation because they realized that I'm going to be an appraiser. I can tell you this as an interesting way to look at this. Having taught classes all over, I get to meet a lot of students. And one of the things that I try to do in education classes is to, make it conversational. So I ask the questions about, who gets approached in that manner? Who's been asked to be that way? And the number of hands that shoot up are tremendous. It's usually just about 100% of the class that have been approached to be, you can be our special appraiser. And, as you said, 2000 to 2008, mortgage brokers flourished. I used to tell a joke that in Miami you could throw a penny and hit two mortgage brokers, one directly and one on the rebound. They were everywhere. And they wanted their own personal guy who they could call their guy. So appraisers were approached by this, but in 2000 to 2006, let's say, the rising tide covered many sins. Even if the appraiser was 10%, 15% too high, in no time at all, because of the rampant growth in real estate values, it was okay. But the minute that stopped, the old theory of at some point the music is going to stop, and who's left without a seat? Well, who was left without a seat were tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people across the country who suddenly realized, wait a second, what I had been told was worth $400,000 is in reality worth $325,000, and it's going down fast. But the point is, what was it worth on the day I took title? That's the question always in these cases, and it is usually a situation where something that is negative is either ignored or something that is lacking is pretended to be there, such as, we're just going to pretend like it's on a golf course. We won't say it is, but all the comparables will come from houses that are back up to a golf course. And they're over in the Huckleberry subdivision, which is, a whole lot nicer. It's 10 years newer, but we'll just kind of ignore all of those dissimilarities. Well, nobody's looking at it because everybody's happy. The buyer got the house they wanted. The lender got the loan that they wanted to make, and they sold it off into the secondary market, and the secondary market didn't really look too hard because it was securitized and out the door it went. As long as somebody was making payments, all is well. It's when the payments stop that people start to look at things, and that's when you realize the level of problems. I've done some work for the state of Florida for the Real Estate Appraisal Board, where they went after appraisers and they asked me to be their expert witness. And some of the things that I have seen are just absolutely shocking that it went through underwriting. It was, this was a closed loan. I taught a few years ago a class about, the idea of using some appraisals that I had seen. Confidential information was redacted, and they had come back to me 4, 5, 6 years after the fact because the payments had stopped, and the appraisers are always absolutely shocked that these loans had made it through underwriting. And I always pointed out, nobody was really asking questions because they're in the transaction. They get paid a slice of the pie. So the appraiser, who's supposed to be IIO, independent, impartial, and objective, when they throw that away, well, now all you've done is become another part of the transaction, and it's when somebody who is ethical looks at it, you realize, wait a second, this is a problem. And then, like you said, the FBI gets involved and all that kind of stuff because at that point, somebody's been damaged.
Well, and guys, we want to, Storm, let's just take a quick break right now, and we'll come back in just a moment.
Yeah, why don't we? Yeah, we're on back time to do it anyway, so.
Yep, Dennis, stay with us.
Will do.
There is a very high likelihood your mortgage contains an extensive error. At Mortgage Fraud Examiners, we know just how costly a missed opportunity can be. For almost 40 years, we have consulted, retained, and referred to by attorneys, lawyers, trial practitioners throughout the nation. Put another way, we are the trusted source for litigation support. A foreclosure is basically an allegation the homeowner breached the contract by failing to make timely payments. The contract is clear. The borrower promised they would make timely payments, and if they didn't, the lender could take the property. The only way to overcome the homeowner's breach is to show the lender breached first. identify errors that would void the contract, identify regulatory violations, identify appraisal fraud and other fraudulent contact. And the only way to find these wrongs is to thoroughly examine the whole mortgage transaction. This meticulous examination of your mortgage transaction and appraisal can identify legal defects that would make your mortgage unenforceable and entitle you to compensation or even free title to your property. Call us at 844-920-7200. Mortgage Fraud Examiners, that's 844-920-7200. 844-920-7200.
Okay, guys, we're back on AM FM 24/7 radio live, and the call-in number is area code 646-668-8512. And our special guest, Dennis Black, the foremost authority on appraisal fraud in the country, has been educating on us how this actually works and what was happening from basically the year 2000 to 2008. Dennis, I was going to kind of dovetail on what you were saying. One of the things that we say at Mortgage Fraud Examiners is that, the one bad thing about the real estate industry is nobody gets paid unless there's a loan. The person selling the property, they don't make the sale unless there's a loan. The real estate agent doesn't make a commission. The mortgage broker doesn't make a commission. The bank doesn't make interest off the money. The title company doesn't sell title insurance, doesn't do the closing. And so when you're in an industry where nobody gets paid unless, in a transaction, unless the transaction goes through and there's a loan made, people will fudge things in order to get paid. And that seems to be what was happening, because I don't know if you remember, Dennis, how many it was, but I seem to recall that there was a petition by appraisers of several thousand. I can't remember the exact number. That
the woman who put it together, Pam Crowley, was the woman who started that. She was out of India County, Florida, over that way near Jupiter. And she had been involved, and she started the petition. She ended up suing a lender who took her off an approved list for no good reason. And it was signed by thousands of appraisers.
I think thousands of appraisers. Yeah.
Well, what happened, Dennis, to all the appraisers that did what they weren't supposed to do? Because in essence, didn't they actually commit fraud if they went to what the realtor said? Hey, it's $400,000, make it $400,000 instead of $300,000. What happened to all of those people that were involved? It seems like nothing really happened.
They never got caught.
Well, I can tell you this: in the state of Florida, and you have to understand, enforcement for appraisers is a by state situation. Okay, I can tell you, closely involved with the state of Florida during those years. The prosecution, the docket for prosecution, it grew to the point where it was 2 days every month for them to handle the situation, and they were sometimes revoking 20 or 30 licenses per month for situations. You also saw in 2008, appraisers in Florida renewed even number of years. So I know Florida very well. 2008, you saw a whole chunk of appraisers not bother to renew because business was drying up. By 2010, a whole other chunk didn't renew. I believe because of the changes in the industry, mortgage brokers kind of dried up. You had at the time the HVCC, which changed the way orders of appraisals took place, and you couldn't have your buddy appraisers, in the same way. Those appraisers, I have to believe, are the ones who kind of left because they were never really appraisers in the true sense. They were form fillers who managed to obtain a certification and were willing to write down whatever. And when push came to shove, they just went on like, the scammers in other situations where they try to stay one step ahead or they just leave and go do something else. A lot of them just left and went and did something else. They were appraisers for 7-8 years. That's it. I started my real estate career in 1980. I started appraising in 1986 after realizing I did not have a salesman's temperament. And that's the only thing I've ever done in my life. Granted, there's been various components of it, an author and lecturer and things like that, but it's always been the same thing. Real estate and real estate valuation has been my life. That's who I am. So a lot of them just went away, I think. But there was tremendous efforts also to prosecute. Now, as far as civilly, I know some appraisers were sued, and they did have to pay damages, or their company had to pay damages. And I'm even aware of 2 cases where they were criminally prosecuted.
Yeah, sounds like though it's
Brown.
Not a lot of people.
The Quicken Loans
not a lot of
Brown
people.
case, where Quicken Loans was ordered to pay $3.6 million to Miss Brown, and she got a settlement of $700,000 from the appraisal firm for overappraising her property. The problem is, we're the only company, mortgage fraud examiners, out there that examines mortgage transactions, and we're the people who look at these transactions, looking for things for homeowners to use against the guys that have harmed them. And part of that is doing a quick look at the appraisal to see if they had followed the USPAP guidelines. Could you explain to our listeners exactly what the USPAP guidelines are and what the appraiser has to sign off on when he does an appraisal, and how that could be useful?
Well, let me dovetail it back here for a quick second. When the crash started happening, I started contacting civil litigation firms and saying, look, I can help you when you are looking at mortgages for defense purposes, because not being an attorney, I thought that they would go try and hire experts and review what the situation was. And every one of them was like, what do I care about the appraisal? So that was my first wake-up. But the standards are, the uniform standards came about after, kind of in conjunction with the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s. And what they are is a standardized set of standards, that's repetitive, but they're professional standards that apply across the country. And, for example, the very first one relating to real property would be that the appraiser has to be knowledgeable relating to having to deal with this type of property and the mechanics of appraising this type of property. Appraising a high-rise condominium penthouse is not the same as appraising a duplex on a golf course. There are different things in play, and if the appraiser doesn't fully understand what's going on, they shouldn't be taking that assignment. It should not be whatever walks in the door. But when we move on into the reporting aspect of it, there is what is called Standard 2-3, and you are required to sign a certification. And one of the major components of that certification is that you are certifying that you are independent, impartial, and objective. And when you're clearly leaving things out, that brings into question whether or not you were biased or not. Because why were you not seeing something that's so obvious? I can tell you one of the first things I always do is run to Google Earth now. And I can remember looking at an appraisal, and it was along the waterfront, and I kept looking at the subdivision, and off to the west of the subdivision was this giant kind of brownish area. And I'm saying to myself, that doesn't look right. Well, within a minute and a half of doing some quick searching on the internet, I learned that it was a landfill that was contaminating the groundwater, and this particular subdivision, which everybody had well water, had an ongoing lawsuit at the time of the date of the appraisal. Not a mention of it in the appraisal. Now, that took me, being many miles away, a minute and a half to learn. Well, if you can't figure that out as an appraiser who supposedly knows about that property type, knows about that location, and you're being independent, objective, and impartial, you're going to report that fact. Well, it wasn't reported. So the standards are a way that the appraiser and the states can put forth some level of uniform enforcement.
Dennis, what's the liability? What's the liability of an appraiser who didn't do it correctly?
Well, it's basically his license as far as the state is concerned, his certification, his credentials.
Okay.
That's all they're allowed to do. I can tell you, the state of Florida, for example, has they're allowed to revoke and issue up to a $5,000 fine. That's it. Civilly, though, that's a different story, and that's why I was quite surprised why attorneys didn't want to, understand more about the situation when you had such blatant, ongoing bad situations. The attorneys didn't care, because to me, you would look at it and say, look, we can sue this individual civilly. Yes, it is an opinion, but it is not a gratuitous assertion. It has to have some evidence behind it, and that evidence has to be credible. Now, appraisers are not held to a standard of perfection, but they are held to a standard of what's called credibility. Is this credible? Well, if you're not bothering to consider the big factors, I see people raise their hands in class. They tell the story of, gee, I go out, I start measuring the house, and the person says, why are you doing that? No other appraiser ever measured the house. So how do you know how big the house is if you never measure it? But that's been done.
They just assume the documents are right, and they might not be, correct?
Well, you have to remember, in some states, not the square footage isn't even public record. So how they're coming up to that guess is anybody's guess. They just eyeball it, maybe.
Yeah, that's true. I had a house where in public records it said it had X amount of bedrooms and X amount of bathrooms, and it was totally wrong. Totally wrong. And so you wonder how some of the stuff gets done. But, Storm, that leads me back to a question where, if the appraiser was told by the realtor, doesn't that constitute racketeering?
Well, no, it's not racketeering, but basically what they're doing is they're working in concert to commit fraud. And nobody, I don't care if you're appraising diamonds or houses or artwork or whatever, nobody is going to pay X amount of dollars for something. When you go to a bank, you are in essence buying money. You're not going to buy money for something that's you're not going to borrow $400,000 on something that's worth $200,000. But that's what they did. Now, what Dennis's problem was in going to these attorneys, it wasn't that they didn't want to litigate this, because it's a very viable case. You can get a very viable case where you can literally get your client millions. The fact was, all of these attorneys were making too much damn money doing nothing by making these stall arguments where they charge $2,500 up front, $1,000 a month. It takes, in a judicial state like Florida, it takes 4 years, 3 to 4 years for it to wind through the court system. So they've made 30 or 40 grand before it ever hit court, and then the house gets foreclosed on because it never had any real argument.
Right.
Versus they could have taken that case and sued up front and won.
But wouldn't that be considered unethical or malpractice on the part of the attorney not to do that?
It is, absolutely. Here's what everyone fails to understand. A foreclosure is a breach of contract case. The bank is alleging that the homeowner breached the contract. In every one of these contracts, the homeowner agreed that if they failed to make timely payments, the bank could take the house and sell it to get their money back. Every homeowner agreed to that. So the problem is that the attorney in a contract case is committing malpractice if he's not looking at the contract. The problem is an attorney doesn't know how to analyze a mortgage transaction and certainly doesn't know how to analyze an appraisal. Now, one other thing that I wanted you to talk about, Dennis, was the document that the appraiser signs is a federal document, is it not?
It gets a little squishy there, but yeah, I think it could be reasonably argued, because particularly in the case of where you're sending something that's been securitized and things like that through Fannie Mae, well, gee, now at what point is this starting to become federal? Now, there's great arguments on the other side of it also, but the biggest thing is that certification is you are signing that you believe that what the appraisal to be true and correct. Okay? Well, if you're signing something that's not true and correct and you're asserting it is, in my non-legal mind, I'm telling a lie. Let's make it easy. I'm telling a lie. I have relatively small children still. I still go to that simple, son, you're lying. It's a lie. So when you sign that document and say, well, this is truthful as far as I understand, and you know damn well it's not, well, that's a lie.
Well,
and, well let's
let me ask if the appraiser fails to properly perform the appraisal, that means the appraiser has violated the USPAP guidelines, the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice. Okay, that's a very high probability.
Okay. There would be some ways it not to happen, but yeah, we're talking better than 99%.
Right, and that violation would also mean that the appraiser signed the certification claiming that the report was USPAP compliant. They were committing fraud.
I would think my understanding on fraud is you have to have knowledge, but to me, it's kind of hard not to have knowledge if you're asserting that you're an expert in that area.
Exactly. Yeah. They're committing fraud when they sign that certificate saying that it was USPAP compliant. They were committing fraud. That's where the court case is. That's where the court case is won, because the argument is he committed fraud when he signed that document, because that document is a Fannie Mae document, right?
Yes, it's their form. Their language is used for whenever you go for a standard residential mortgage, Fannie Mae is the one who designs that document.
Exactly.
Guys, I want to go to a quick break, but one of the things in the last segment, if it's okay, Dennis, I'd like you to talk about is how what you do can help people now that are still in foreclosure that may have had appraisals, where the situation is now coming back to court. So let's do a quick commercial break, and we'll talk about that when we come back. Stay with us.
Consumers, do you have bad credit? Can't purchase a house or car? Paying too much in interest on your credit cards and loans? Scammed by credit repair companies? There is hope. You can get back on track and do it the right way. Call Credit Education Consultants today at 813-500-6064. That's 813-500-6064. Or go to crediteducationconsultants.com now and get the help you need. Don't delay. Call today. Mortgage reps and realtor inquiries are also welcomed.
Okay, we're back on AM FM 24/7 radio. The call-in number is area code 646-668-8512 with our special guest, Appraiser Dennis Black. And Laurie, you had a specific question that you had for Dennis.
Right. So houses that maybe made it, are still in foreclosure from way back when. How do you go about back in time? I've heard it called different things like a forensic appraisal or a retrospective field analysis. But how can you help people now who maybe are in foreclosure, whose cases were delayed for whatever reason, and they may not even know about this about what you do, or they know what mortgage fraud examiner does. How can you help them now?
The official name is a retrospective appraisal, and
okay.
The first thing is they need to know whether or not the original appraisal had any deficiencies. So that would be a review, and there's all sorts of fancy names for different types of review, but essentially, depending upon the situation and how much do you have for a budget, you figure out, okay, how much investigation do I want, someone such as myself to do? The first thing is always looking at the original appraisal. Now, I could look at the original appraisal and, there might be the house across the street closed the prior day. It's the exact same model. The house down the street sold 2 weeks earlier. It's the exact same model, nice tight range. You're not going anywhere there. I've had other situations, like I said, where I looked at the appraisal and, this person's on a 10,000 square foot normal lot looking back at somebody else's house. Look at all the comparables. You pull them up on Google Earth and they're sitting on golf courses. Well, the next step then is to hire someone to do a retrospective appraisal. Now, a retrospective appraisal, you need to get someone who's local to look at that. The first can be done by someone who has good credentials, such as myself. I've done what are called desktop reviews to all across the country, because what you're looking for is methodology there, okay? In the retrospective appraisal, you're looking at, okay, I need geographic competency here. I need somebody local. And in that case, you're literally going back in time and pretending it's the same date. I did one not too long ago. I went back 9 years in time. And that means you're looking at old public records and things of that nature. So, yes, it's not the same type of cost because the number of hours of investigation changes. Now, it's not the size of the report that drives the cost. It is the amount of hours of investigation that drives the cost. So in that situation, you can hire a retrospective appraisal, and you can find out, gee, wait a second, as I said earlier, the first appraiser told me it was worth $400,000. But now we have good evidence that it's worth $325,000. I'm in foreclosure, and as Storm points out, that is a civil matter. It is a litigation situation. It's a contract breach. Well, now you have a piece of evidence to go for your side. So, that's basically what we do, is we do a lot of looking back in time. In some ways, I still feel like I'm living through the crash because, 50% of my time is looking at stuff from 2004 through 2008. So in many ways, I've not moved forward in my business. I'm looking at that old stuff, but it's just a question of going back in time. And you look at old documents and you look at old public records and you do the analysis the exact same way. It's just a little bit more difficult to get information.
Now, Storm, does that fall into the fraudulent inducement? When you talk about attacking the contract, does that fall into the fraudulent inducement if the house was overappraised?
That's what I've been told from attorneys. Exactly. Look, if you're told it's worth $400,000 and it's only worth $325,000, you were fraudulently induced. That's my understanding of it.
Yeah, that's exactly how it works. Now, and for our listeners and for anybody else who will listen on our podcast, is I get this question all the time. Okay, Storm, and we do the whole transaction like Dennis does for the appraisal. It's retrospective in the fact of what happened back then. The question that I always get is, okay, I got this loan in 2005. Hasn't the statute of limitations run? Well, here's how it works in the real world. Fraud is from when you find it or should have found it. So you could have gotten a loan in 1970, and if you found appraisal fraud today, the statute of limitations would run starting today. You'd be good to go to sue. Also, when the statute of limitations basically means that you can sue as a plaintiff. If you're within the statute of limitations, you can sue as a plaintiff, okay? If you're outside of the statute of limitations, you can't sue as a plaintiff. However, this is how the courts look at it. If you're in a defensive posture where the bank is trying to take your house and the statute of limitations has run, well, obviously you can't sue as a plaintiff because the statute of limitations has run. But if your rights were violated for the sake of argument, appraisal fraud or any of these other myriad of problems that can be wrong with the mortgage transaction, the courts look at it and say, okay, well, they did screw the homeowner. We can't let them sue as a plaintiff, but we sure as hell can give them what they could have gotten if they sued as a plaintiff if the bank's trying to take their house. So, yes, the answer is you could have gotten that loan years and years ago. Dennis can do that retrospective. We do our thing. Matter of fact, we recommend Dennis many times to do retrospective appraisals to our clients because we just look at some very small things and that leads us to believe that there's appraisal fraud. And then what we do is, especially in the area where Dennis is located, we say, hey, look, here's somebody you need to call now, get a retrospective appraisal done so you can get the evidence. Because what we do, mortgage fraud examiners provide the evidence of what happened in that transaction. Dennis doing a retrospective appraisal is doing the same thing. He's providing evidence to use to win your case. So as I explain to everyone, this isn't high math. This is really easy stuff. The problem is that the stall attorneys, the scammers out there that are doing all these ridiculous securitization audits, forensic chain of title audits, just taking people's money and wasting their time, you're going to lose your home, flat out, unless you have that transaction analyzed, and that includes that appraisal.
Gotcha. Well, maybe we should have Dennis give out some of his contact information.
Yes, we should.
The best way to get in touch with me is through my website, correctassessment.net. And the email that comes directly to me is DJB, my initials, Dennis James Black, at correctassessment.net. That's the best way to get a hold of me, because I can tell you if you dial the phone, you're probably going to get right to my messages, because I spend quite a bit of time on the phone. So email is the best way to go.
Also, Dennis, don't you do some work as a judge for taxes?
I serve as what's called in the state of Florida a special magistrate for tax disputes, for real property tax disputes. And it's interesting because one of the things I do there is weigh evidence. The property appraiser, what they're called in this state, and some other states are called tax assessor, brings how they came to assess the property. The homeowner or property owner comes to me and says, okay, this is my evidence, and I then weigh that evidence. So I've had a lot of time understanding evidence and dealing with it as the one weighing it and also as the one providing it for my client. And one of the things I can tell you is, nothing should be shortcutted. That's always the answer. You mentioned paying, all sorts of money on a monthly basis, and then they turn to someone, me, and they say, well, gee, how much do you charge? And I'll give a quote, and then I'll go, well, how much are you saving each month by not paying your mortgage? Or how much are you paying that attorney who does nothing but occasionally file a piece of paper every month?
Mm-hmm.
And the funny thing is, they don't want to pay up front. They would just rather be ongoing and kick the can down the road.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for joining us, because I think you explained what you do really well, and thanks for giving out your contact information. Storm, we got about a minute. Any last comments?
Well, I know Dennis, and I know Dennis is, again, in my opinion, and it's just not my opinion, it's a lot of people's opinions, is that he's probably the foremost guy in the country. If you need somebody to do one of these retrospectives, he's the guy to call. Now, unfortunately, as Dennis pointed out, he can't do them all over the country. He can only basically do the retrospectives, locally. But what can you do around the country, Dennis, real quick?
Well, the first thing is get a first blush. Get a look at that appraisal and see what's going on. The other thing is, because of my work around the country, I do know an awful lot of appraisers around the country, so you don't have to just go to the yellow pages and pick a name out of a hat, so to speak. So if I can get a look at that appraisal and possibly give that person some direction where this doesn't look right, that doesn't look right, go investigate that. That's the biggest thing.
Got it.
Well, I tell you what, great show, Dennis, and we really appreciate you coming on and giving us an idea of what goes on out there in the world, because it really is, it's a very important subject. I mean, I tell everybody, I said, look, securitization audits are a waste of time, a waste of money, but if you got a securitization audit, that has nothing to do with your appraisal. So you could be giving up a big slice. The FDIC said 76% of them are bad. Dennis, I think you concur with that if 76% of the appraisals are bad, why aren't you looking at the appraisal? That's why we at Mortgage Fraud Examiners look at everything, because if you're going to win your case, you got to have evidence. And just as Dennis pointed out, as a magistrate, if you go to court in a judicial state, that's what that judge does. He weighs the evidence. If you don't have anything to weigh, you're going to lose your house.
Right. Well, we've got to run, guys, so thank you both. And for our listeners, thanks for joining us today on Fraudsters Radio. Please join us again next Monday from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time live. Remember, we do want to hear your stories. Contact us through the Fraudsters Radio Facebook page. Great show, guys, and thanks for our listeners for tuning in.
Okie doke. Bye.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.